A thin beam of light pierces through the cracks in the log ceiling, falling onto an improvised operating table. This table is made of 2 school desks pushed together, covered with a sheet that was boiled in a cauldron with ash just an hour ago. The air in the dugout is heavy, thick, permeated with the smell of pine resin, cheap tobacco, and the sharp, undeniable aroma of blood. The surgeon, a man with tired eyes and a week-old stubble, holds an instrument that would cause dismay in any city hospital. It is not a scalpel made of alloy steel. It is a dangerously sharpened, straight razor blade, tied with a coarse thread to a wooden stick. The assistant, a very young girl whose hands tremble from tension, but not from fear, holds a kerosene lamp above the wound, covered on 3 sides with a casing so that no light escapes into the night forest. Outside, above the tops of ancient fir trees, the engine of a reconnaissance plane drones. The enemy is looking for this camp. If the pilot spots even a spark, a firestorm will begin here in 10 minutes. But the operation does not stop for a second. The patient on the table does not groan. He has bitten down on a thick leather belt so hard that a creak is audible. There is no anesthesia. There is only a glass of homemade alcohol, drunk in one gulp, and the quiet, soothing murmur of the doctor, who promises that this guy will still dance in the main square of the liberated city. In this moment, at this point in space and time, converges the entire essence of an incredible phenomenon that historians would later call the miracle of forest medicine. Here, among swamps and windfalls, people in white coats, often blackened with soot and dirt, defied inevitability itself, saving lives where, by all laws of logic, only destruction reigned. To understand how this became possible, one must mentally transport oneself to the time when the familiar world collapsed. This happened in the summer of 1941. The front was rolling back eastward with terrifying speed, leaving behind enemy lines vast territories, dense forests, and thousands of people who had not managed or been able to leave. Surrounded military units, local residents who did not want to put up with the new order, party workers, all flocked under the canopy of trees. The forest became their fortress, their home, and their only hope. But along with the first resistance detachments came the first, most terrible problem. Any war is not only tactics and strategy, it is first and foremost physiology. The human body is fragile. A bullet, a shrapnel, frost, bad water, all these disable a soldier faster than direct combat encounters. In a regular army, a gigantic logistics machine stands behind the soldier. Evacuation trains, hospitals, pharmaceutical factories, institutes. The people who went into the forest had nothing. The first months resembled chaos. The wounded were left in villages with reliable people, but this was a huge risk. If a wounded person was found, the entire family that sheltered him suffered. It became clear that a medical service must become an integral part of the forest camp, as mobile and invisible as the combat groups themselves. However, recognizing the problem did not mean solving it. Doctors who found themselves in partisan detachments faced a professional nightmare. Imagine a surgeon accustomed to sterile cleanliness, electric light, a set of hundreds of shining instruments, and an unlimited supply of bandages. And now he stands in the middle of a swamp, mud squelching under his feet, with only his personal experience and will to resist as his medical supplies. No iodine, no cotton, no plaster, no painkillers. There is only the forest. And it was the forest, this ancient, silent ally, that began to give clues to those who were willing to listen and experiment. Here begins a story of incredible ingenuity born of desperation. When factory-made cotton ran out, doctors turned their attention to what healers and hermits had used for centuries: sphagnum, bog moss. This plant has unique hygroscopic properties. It absorbs moisture 25 times its own weight, surpassing the performance of the best cotton wool. But its main advantage was not even that. Sphagnum contains phenol-like substances, sphagnol, which is a powerful natural antiseptic. Wounds dressed with properly prepared moss did not fester, healed faster, and the smell, that heavy companion of gangrenous wards, disappeared. The process of harvesting moss became an entire industry for the forest republics. Special groups, often consisting of children and women, went to the swamps. The moss not only had to be collected, it had to be sorted, cleaned of twigs and dirt, lightly dried, but not over-dried, otherwise it would crumble into dust. Then it was pressed into bales and sterilized with steam. This was the first step towards creating an autonomous supply system. But what to replace bandages with? When gauze supplies ran out, everything was used: underwear, old sheets collected from the population, and even parachute silk. Parachutes, on which cargo was dropped from the mainland, were valued more than gold. The fabric of the canopy was cut into strips, boiled in lye, a solution of wood ash, and used for dressings. After use, such bandages were not thrown away. They were washed, boiled again, ironed with heavy irons heated on coals, and put back into use. The cycle repeated dozens of times until the fabric turned into rags. The hardest part was the instrumentation. Surgery is a craft that requires precise tools. When a scalpel broke or a clamp was lost, there was nowhere to get a new one, and then forest craftsmen came to the rescue. Blacksmiths and locksmiths, who, in peaceful life, repaired tractors and shod horses. In forest forges, set up in remote ravines, the magic of metal was created. Amputation knives were forged from the springs of crippled German trucks. Wound retractors were bent from ordinary wire. Dental forceps were made from pliers, carefully grinding and polishing the working surfaces so as not to shatter the tooth during extraction. Needles deserve special mention. A surgical needle has a special shape and eyelet. Making one in makeshift conditions is incredibly difficult. But the craftsmen managed to bore eyelets in ordinary sewing needles, bend them at the right angle, and temper them. Horsehair pulled from the tails of the healthiest horses, or silk threads unraveled from the same parachute lines, were used as suture material. All this required superhuman patience and precision. The external, material scarcity was only the first layer of the problem. Beneath it lay a much deeper internal conflict that doctors and nurses faced every day. It was an ethical and psychological conflict. A doctor is called to alleviate suffering. But how to alleviate it when you don't have morphine? Operations were performed _0_ or under local anesthesia, made from miraculously obtained Novocaine, which was saved for cavity operations. In other cases, moonshine was used, a cloudy liquid distilled right there in the forest from grain, potatoes, or even sawdust. A glass of this liquid was the only barrier between the wounded person's consciousness and the unbearable pain of the scalpel. Doctors were forced to become tough, sometimes even cruel, to save lives. They made decisions that would have turned their hair gray overnight in peacetime. Whom to save first? The one with a minor injury who can pick up a rifle in a week? Or the one who is severely wounded in the abdomen and requires a complex operation with minimal chances of success? But he is a human, a comrade, a living soul. In conditions of time and energy deficit, this choice turned into a daily torture of conscience. And most often, the logic of war dictated harsh rules. priority was given to those who could be returned to duty. But, contrary to this logic, doctors fought for everyone to the last, staying by the hopeless for days, breaking all laws of physical exhaustion. Among the medical personnel, there were many women. Very young girls, yesterday's schoolgirls or medical college students, became guardian angels for stern men. The heaviest physical labor fell on their fragile shoulders. To drag a wounded man from the battlefield when bullets whistle all around, to carry him several kilometers through deep snow or viscous swamp, to load him onto a cart, this required titanic effort, and they coped. But even harder was to withstand the psychological pressure, to see strong young men turn into helpless children from pain, to hear their dying words, to close their eyes. This required an iron will. Many of these girls hid their tears, allowing themselves to cry only when no one was watching, burying their faces in an armful of fragrant spruce branches. There was also a third, philosophical layer to this confrontation. It was a clash of two concepts: destruction and creation. War, by its nature, aims at annihilation. Medicine at preservation. Deep in enemy territory, where the very atmosphere was permeated with danger and death, forest hospitals became islands of humanism. Here, not only bodies were treated, but souls were saved. A wounded fighter entering the dugout of the hospital saw care, saw clean, as much as possible, sheets, felt the warmth of human hands. This restored his faith that the world had not completely gone mad, that there were things more important than hatred. In these conditions, paradoxical situations arose. There are known cases where partisan doctors provided aid to wounded enemy soldiers who had been captured. The Hippocratic Oath has no nationality, and a doctor remained a doctor even in the hell of war. Of course, this caused disputes and conflicts among fighters craving revenge, but the authority of the chief surgeon was often indisputable. Such moments became the highest manifestation of humanity, proving that even in brutal conditions, a person can remain human. Gradually, with the passage of time, the situation began to change. The chaotic groups of the first months of the war transformed into powerful formations. Entire partisan regions emerged in the forests, vast territories completely controlled by the resistance where there was no occupation administration. In such zones, the medical service acquired the features of a state system. Not just dugouts were built, but real underground hospital complexes. Imagine such an underground city. Wood-paneled corridors connect several spacious rooms. There is an admission department, an operating room, wards for convalescents, a kitchen, a bathhouse, and even an isolation ward for infectious patients. Ventilation was carried out through hollow tree trunks led to the surface and camouflaged in bushes. Lighting was provided by smokers made from shell casings, filled with fat or captured dynamos, which were cranked by hand or with a bicycle drive. A real breakthrough was the establishment of communication with the mainland. When the front stabilized, planes flew across the front line. The legendary corn dusters, light biplanes capable of landing on tiny forest clearings or frozen lakes, became a lifeline. They brought the most essential supplies: real surgical instruments, concentrated medicines, tetanus antitoxin, canned blood. Seriously wounded, those who could not be saved in forest conditions were evacuated on return flights. These air bridges operated mainly at night. Pilots showed miracles of skill, navigating by bonfires lit on the ground in a specific order. The sound of a small plane's engine was a sound of hope for the wounded. But reliance on aviation did not negate the need for improvisation. The weather could be unflyable for weeks. And then, forest medics once again turned to the experience of their ancestors. Phytotherapy and folk remedies were widely introduced into medical practice, but already on a scientific basis. Doctors compiled reference books of medicinal plants growing in the area. Pine needle broth became the main source of vitamin C, saving people from scurvy, a terrible scourge that caused teeth to fall out and old wounds to open. It turned out that ordinary pine needles contained more vitamins than lemons. It was brewed in huge barrels, and everyone, from commander to rank and file, was forced to drink it as medicine. Birch tar was used to treat skin diseases, scabies, which spread instantly in crowded conditions and lack of hygiene. Soothing infusions were made from valerian roots, plantain, yarrow, St. John's wort. The entire forest turned into a huge green pharmacy. Unique methods for treating burns and frostbite using goose fat and beeswax were developed. In some detachments, they even learned to make simple prostheses for those who had lost limbs, so that these people could take care of themselves and help in the camp. But the most dramatic test for secret hospitals was punitive expeditions. When the enemy launched a large-scale operation to clear the forest, bringing in tank divisions and aviation, the hospital became the most vulnerable point of the detachment. The wounded could not run quickly. They were a burden from a military point of view, but sacred from a moral one. The evacuation of a hospital is an epic worthy of the pen of great playwrights. Everyone who could hold a weapon took up circular defense. The rest began loading. The seriously wounded were placed on sleds, carts, or simply on drags made of branches. The doctor had to decide in minutes what equipment to take and what to hide or destroy. Boxes of instruments were buried in the ground, smeared with a thick layer of fat to prevent rust, and marks were made on trees to return later, and then the retreat began. Often they had to retreat into the most impassable swamps, where enemy vehicles dared not venture. People waded waist-deep in icy water, carrying comrades on stretchers. Medics ensured that bandages didn't get wet, and that the wounded didn't lose consciousness from the pain of jolting. Sometimes such journeys lasted for days. In these conditions, dressings were changed right on hummocks, under covered raincoats, by the light of a pocket flashlight, whose batteries they warmed against their chests. One such story occurred in the winter of '43. A large partisan hospital found itself encircled. There was no way out. The command made a daring decision to break through not deeper into the forest, but on the contrary, across the front line, towards the advancing Red Army. The convoy with the wounded stretched for kilometers. To conceal their tracks, they moved during a fierce blizzard. Doctors walked alongside the sleds, constantly checking if the patients were alive, rubbing snow on their faces so they wouldn't freeze to death. During halts, they boiled water in buckets directly over fires built in pits, so no light would be visible, and changed frozen bandages. This icy march lasted 2 weeks, and they made it. They saved almost everyone. It was a triumph of will and professionalism. Among the endless series of difficult daily routines, there were also moments that could be called true miracles. For example, performing complex abdominal surgeries. There is a known case where a surgeon in a dugout removed a shrapnel from a soldier's pericardium. The chest cavity was opened with retractors made from hunting knives. The commander's wife, formerly a literature teacher, who used to faint at the sight of blood, assisted and stood firm as a rock at that moment. The doctor held the heart in his palm. One wrong move, and it would be over. But his hand did not tremble. The soldier survived and returned to duty 3 months later. Such cases became legends, passed from detachment to detachment, instilling confidence in people. We cannot be broken. Our doctors can raise the dead. A special role was played by the so-called __0 These were disguised bases in the deep rear of partisan zones where the wounded underwent rehabilitation. True bathhouses were built there, and enhanced nutrition was organized. Local residents brought milk, eggs, cottage cheese. They gave the best of everything to the wounded. Here, coniferous baths were practiced to calm the nervous system and treat skin problems. Hot water, infused with spruce branches, was poured into hollowed-out logs. This fragrant steam, warmth, and silence healed better than any pills. People who had survived the horror of battles thawed in spirit, began to smile, and write letters to relatives, even if they couldn't be sent. However, we should not idealize the picture. Mortality was high. Tetanus, gangrene, typhus, pneumonia mowed down the ranks of partisans no worse than enemy bullets. The lack of elementary antibiotics led to tragedies. When a person died from a scratch that became inflamed, doctors experienced every loss as a personal defeat. In their diaries, written on scraps of newspapers or birch bark, one can find lines full of despair and pain. Today we lost Sasha, 18 years old, sepsis. If I had one ampule of penicillin, he would be alive. I look at my hands and hate their powerlessness. These documents are silent witnesses to the price medics paid for their work. And yet, the system worked. The statistics, collected after the war, are astounding. More than 70% of wounded partisans returned to duty. This figure is comparable to the indicators of the regular army, which had full-fledged rear support. How is this possible? The answer lies not in technology, but in people. In the incredible dedication with which doctors, nurses, and orderlies performed their duty, in the support provided by the local population, in the thirst for life that the wounded themselves had, forest medicine became a unique phenomenon, showing that the capabilities of the human body and mind are practically limitless when it comes to survival. Doctors learned to see nature not as a hostile environment, but as a resource. They learned to replace high-tech drugs with what grows underfoot. They proved that sterility is not so much the absence of microbes as the purity of intentions and the precision of actions. The culmination of this struggle for life was 1944. The liberation of territories was in full swing. Partisan detachments connected with regular units, and then military surgeons from frontline hospitals, who had seen a lot, entered forest dugouts and froze in amazement. They saw neatly applied stitches with parachute threads. They saw splints made of birch bark, which fixed fractures no worse than factory plaster. They saw amputated stumps, healed perfectly evenly, treated with moss and honey. This experience of forest colleagues evoked deep respect. Many methods born in the forests were later studied and described in medical treatises. The use of phytoncides, methods of primary wound treatment in the field, methods of transportation, all this became part of military medicine's treasury. But the most important legacy of these events lies not in the realm of medicine, but in the realm of the spirit. The story of partisan hospitals is a lesson for us, living in an era of high technologies. We are used to relying on complex devices and the availability of medicines, on comfort. We often falter before difficulties when our internet or hot water is cut off. But those people, in icy dugouts without light or warmth, did the impossible. They showed that the main tool of a doctor is not a scalpel, but their heart and mind. That compassion can be stronger than pain. That even in the darkest circumstances, one can find light and a way to help one's neighbor. When the war ended, many forest hospitals were simply abandoned. The dugouts collapsed, the trenches overgrown with grass. The forest took back what it had given to people. Trees healed their wounds with resin. Moss covered the sites of former campfires with a green carpet. But the memory of what happened here remained. It lives in the saved lives, in generations that were born because once, many years ago, a tired surgeon did not give up and continued the operation under the roar of enemy planes. Today, walking through those forests, one can stumble upon strange mounds, the remains of rotten logs. If you look closely, you can find a rusty bed frame or a glass vial, darkened by time. These are the traces of a great battle for life, a battle where the weapons were not rifles, but bandages made from old sheets and faith in victory. These places preserve silence. But this silence is more eloquent than any words. It reminds us that humanity is indestructible, that life always finds a way, even through pain, blood, and cold, and that the feet of a doctor, saving enemy and friend, child and old man, is sacred at all times. Looking at modern medicine, we see gleaming clinics, robot surgeons, instant diagnostics. This is wonderful, but the foundation of this well-being is mixed, among other things, with the experience of those who boiled instruments in a bucket of rainwater. With their mistakes, with their discoveries, with their sacrifices. We must remember that technology is only an assistant. At the center always stands man, the one who makes the decision, the one who takes responsibility, the one who holds the hand of the dying and says, mentally returning to that first dugout where an operation was taking place under the light of a kerosene lamp, we no longer see just a surgeon and a patient. We see a symbol of resistance to death itself. The razor blade in the doctor's hand ceases to be a surrogate instrument. It becomes a sword cutting through darkness. And as long as there are such people, ready to act against all odds, ready to create amidst destruction, humanity has a future. The forest remembers them, and we too must remember. For it is this memory that makes us human, connecting us with an invisible thread to those who gave us the right to life, snatching it from oblivion with their hands, stained with earth and blood, but pure before eternity. This story is not about war. It is about the love of life, which is stronger than any weapon. It is about medicine not being a service, but a ministry. And no matter where a person finds themselves, in a modern metropolis or in a wild forest, they are capable of miracles if driven by the desire to save another. This is the main lesson of the forest hospitals, which we are obliged to preserve and pass on. A lesson in courage, ingenuity, and boundless mercy.